Hello everyone! Welcome to mindbraintalks, the place where you find diverse and scientifically accurate information regarding psychology, neuropsychology, neurosciences and research methods every single week. My name is Bruno Faustino. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist who's been working as a therapist, researcher and educator for the past few years. All videos here are just for educational purposes and it's not intended to diagnose any psychiatric condition or neurological disorder. So, without further delay, let's jump for today's content. These are the 6 manuals that I used to develop this video. So, let's go see them. So the first is the Principles of Neuropsychology. The second, Fundamentals of Human Neuropsychology. The third, it's the Neuropsychology Handbook. The fourth, it's the Handbook of Clinical Neuropsychology. The fifth, it's the Neuropsychological Assessment from Lesac, which is a very good manual. And the sixth, it was the Clinical Neuropsychology from Laura Gonstein and Jane McNeil. As you are seeing, neuropsychology is the scientific field that studies the relationships between brain, behavior and cognition. The notion that the brain is the organ of the mind and the brain is the organ of neurocognitive processes, it's not new to us. However, this idea had been developed for many years. So let's look to the story of neuropsychology and let's look to the story about how the brain starts to get noticed as the center of the mind. So, the notion of neuropsychology, or the notion about the study of the relationship between brain and behavior, can be traced through ancient history, or even earlier. There were too much debate in different societies when we start to considering that the body and the mind could be related to different organs in our brain, in our mind. So for many centuries the brain was thought to be useless and discarded. This notion has been changed through time, through the evolution in anatomy and physiology. So let's take a brief overview on this. Mental functions were viewed from a religious point of view, and human mental dysfunctions were attributed to evil spirits and the gods. I think this is not new information for you. So the brain has not always been considered the center of the functioning body. It took too many centuries to acknowledge that the importance of the brain as the organ of the mind. This is a core feature here. Now we know that the brain is the main organ of the mind. So many functions that our mind have would not be possible if the brain is not there, if the brain is not working, okay? So, even in antiquity, lots of researchers tried to study the brain, and they developed a technique called the trephination, which is defined as the ancient surgical operation that involves cutting, scraping, chiseling or drilling a plug-like piece of bone from the skull. As you can see here in this picture, the physicians tend to do some kind of hole in the brain and they try to study the brain within a living person. The classical Greeks wrote the first accounts of the brain and behavior relationships. Heraclitus was one of the first philosophers that say that the mind is an enormous space with never-ending boundaries. So he has the notion that the mind is a very, very huge domain which we may never look to his boundaries. However, Pythagoras, a very well-known ancient Greek philosopher, was the first to suggest that the brain could be the center of the human reasoning and may play a role in the soul's life. So this is the fundamentals and the essentials of that later became known as the brain hypothesis, which is the idea that the brain is the source of all behavior. So here, Heraclitus and Pythagoras were the first ones that start to develop the notion that maybe the brain could be the center of the mind, and also it could be the center of the soul. This is the fundamentals of the brain hypothesis. So, another ancient Greek, a very well-known ancient Greek, Hippocrates, which is the father of modern medicine, also believed that the brain controls all senses and movements. He studied some patients where paralysis occurred in the side of the body opposite to the side of the head injury. This is very important because it's the first time in history that we start to get notice that the brain could be working on opposite sides of the body. This is very important. So, following the areas governed by the right and left hemispheres of the brain, Hippocrates noticed that one side of the brain could lead to or could govern other areas, contralateral areas of the body. This is very important. So, Hippocrates also stated that pleasure, merriment, laughter, amusement, as well as grief, pain and anxiety could all arise from the brain. This is also a very important notion because we start to notice that not only body movement but also some kind of mental states or states of mind could also arise from the brain and from the brain functioning. However, Plato suggested that the soul may be divided or could be divided in three different parts: appetite, reason and temper. This kind of notion had helped Freud to develop his notions about the mind, which is id or id, ego and superego. So Freud, do you know Freud? Of course, Freud starts to use the notion of Plato to develop his own theory about conscious and unconscious mind. However, not all ancient philosophers believed that the brain was the center of the body. Not all ancient philosophers believed that the brain was the center of the body and the brain was important to behavior. Aristotle, which is also a very known Greek philosopher, was a creative thinker in various fields. However, he made some mistakes. He believed that the heart could be the source of all mental processes, and he developed which was known as the cardiac hypothesis, where the heart is the seat of every emotions and the heart is the seat of every mental process. Later, in Egypt, Alexandria School developed some different notions. Scientists work hard in new advances in physiology and anatomy, and knowledge of the nervous system and neuroanatomy were stemmed from the performing of public dissections. So these scientists start to perform public dissections about dead people. However, these dissections had boosted the knowledge about the nervous system, which is also very important. So they start to develop which was later known as the ventricular localization hypothesis, which postulates that mental and spiritual processes may reside in the ventricular chambers of the brain. This hypothesis later became known as the cell doctrine, which means that the cell is a small compartment in a ventricle. This theory, this doctrine, take about 2,000 years to be developed. So, together with Hippocrates, Galen was one of the greatest physicians of his time, and he took different advances about the anatomic knowledge of the brain, and he may be coined as the first experimental physiologist, which identified many of the major brain structure and described the behavioral changes that was related to different brain traumas. So, Galen also described that all physical functions included in the brain, as well as the rest of the body, depends on the balance of the bodily fluids or humors, which he referred to air, water, fire, and earth. He identified different brain areas which were related to different behaviors and different emotions. This was a major step on the understanding of the brain and on the understanding about how the brain could be the underlying organ of emotion and behavior. However, other authors were very important on the development of this idea that the brain is the organ of the mind. So later, Albert Magnus described that behavior results from a combination of brain structures that includes the cortex, the midbrain, and the cerebellum. Andres Vesalius found some Gale's anatomic mistakes and he corrected them. Particularly, he corrected those errors that were related to the role of the ventricles and their effect on behavior. Also, Descartes, as you know, it's a very well-known philosopher that split the mind and the brain into physical different identities. So, he split between mental processes and physical abilities, and he stated that the mind and the body are separate. However, they may interact with each other. He stated that the pineal gland was the means by the body and the spirit, the body and the mind would interact. This is known as the dualism of the Descartes. Later, Thomas Willis described that the blood circulation in the brain, and he theorized that all mental faculties reside in the corpus striatum, a structure that is very deep within the cerebral hemispheres. So, as you can see here, different contributions from different authors start to emphasize different features of the brain functioning and the relationship between the brain and the mind, or in their words, the brain and the soul. So, now let's just summarize the contents of today. So, neuropsychology studies the relationship between brain, mind, and behavior. The brain and antiquity was an object of studies between the Greeks. However, the brain was not the center of the mind, was not the center of the soul. And the cell doctrine was a notion that stems from 2000 years of different discoveries about the workings of the mind and the workings of the brain, and anatomic discoveries of the soul, which we called anatomic discoveries of the mind, were very important to establish the brain as the organ of the mind, or in their language, in their notions, the organs of the soul. Well, it's all for today. Don't forget to see the video description regarding today's theme, to see the manuals and the books that I am recommending to you. Also, if you like what I'm doing here, please consider to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Welcome to mindbraintalks, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye! Hello everyone! Welcome to mindbraintalks, the place where you find diverse and scientifically accurate information regarding psychology, neuropsychology, neurosciences and research methods every single week. My name is Bruno Faustino. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist who's been working as a therapist, researcher and educator for the past few years. Here in mindbraintalks, I discussed and describe different topics related to psychology and neurosciences, and I try to explain them the best as I can for you to understand and for you to know something more about it. All videos here are just for educational purposes, and it's not intended to diagnose any psychiatric condition or neurological disorder. So, without further delay, let's jump for today's content. So, this is the second video related to the theme what is neuropsychology. As we saw in the previous video, there are lots of different perspectives that were developed through the centuries and were the fundamentals of the idea about how the brain may be the organ of the mind. In this video, we will expand the notion and we will see how it evolved from the center of the soul to be the center of the mind, the brain to be the center of the mind, and how it can be applied to different branches of neuropsychology. Of course, the scientific discipline of neuropsychology had evolved parallel with other scientific major branches, such as neurosciences, neurobiology, or even medicine. But now let's see how it evolved from earlier findings to the contemporary findings. So now let's look at the manuals that I recommend to you today. The first one is the Principles of Neuropsychology. The second one is the Fundamentals of Human Neuropsychology. The third is the Neuropsychology Handbook. The fourth is the Clinical Neuropsychology, the second edition from Jennifer Guard and John Marshall. The fifth is the Neuropsychological Assessment from Lezac. And the sixth is the Clinical Neuropsychology, a practical guide to assessment and management for clinicians. So now let's continue the second part of the video dedicated to the history of neuropsychology. So, Franz Gall stated that the brain consists of a number of separate organs, each one responsible for basic psychological traits such as courage and friendliness. Franz Gall stated that the brain would also be explored by its geography, which is the notion of the borders at the time when people were discovering and mapping new continents. So, Franz Gall applied the notion of geography to brain exploration. Gall's basic theory defined of localization of brain functions, which is called the science of phrenology, which is how the phrenology was born. Gall's basic theory of localization was called phrenology. A given brain area is enlarged, then the corresponding area of the skull will also be enlarged, which is the notion that the brain may have some specific geography. Gall's theory was based on this assumption. In the beginning of the 20th century, there were two major neuropsychologists that were very important to establish the idea of language and localization. These two major neuropsychologists are Broca and Wernicke. Let's look to their major contributions. So, before the 19th century, people knew little about the cortex and the brain. Scientific evidence supporting a localization position of different functions in the brain was not available till 1861. Paul Broca found that motor speech was specifically located in the posterior inferior region of the left frontal lobe. Broca was also the founder of French anthropology. This is quite a curious fact. Broca's landmark contribution was in the understanding of the origins of aphasia, which is a neuropsychological syndrome. In Paris, he was a professor of chirurgy, which contributed most to the advancing of the field of brain anatomy. Broca presented two clinical cases to support his proposal for the locus of speech. So, he stated that individuals who had extensive injuries involving different brain areas, such as left posterior frontal lobe, corresponding paralysis on the right side of motor speech deficits. Again, this is the idea of a contralateral organization of motor speech. But in other respects, they appeared to be intelligent and normal. So Broca started to note that individuals who have motor speech deficits had intelligent or normal other mental functions, which is an evidence of differentiated brain functionings based on different localizations. A decade after Broca's discovery, Carl Wernicke, another neuropsychologist that was very important to understand the speech phenomena, found that the understanding of speech was located in the superior posterior aspects of the temporal lobe. So a different area, a different brain area from motor speech production. So Wernicke noted that no motor deficit accompanied a loss of speech or comprehension caused by a damage in this area. Only the ability to understand speech was disrupted, which means that motor production of speech may be localized in a different area from speech comprehension. So this was very important in the advancement of cortical localization. And this cortical deficit was called wernicaphasia, which is a loss of speech comprehension caused by damage in the area of superior posterior aspects of temporal lobe. Another patient that was very important on the understanding of cortical localization of brain functioning was Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was an American railroad worker who survived a massive accident where a large iron rod was driven completely through his head. This iron rod destroyed much of his brain's left frontal lobe, and Phineas Gage had recovered from this accident. However, his family and his friends start to notice some modifications in his personality, which means that this could be related to destruction of specific brain area. Phineas Gage raised a number of issues and fostered a discussion in the 19th century about the brain localization of mental functions and fostered the debate between mind and brain interactions, which was very important on the development of neuropsychology as a scientific field. Freud was also very important in the field of neuropsychology because he criticized the notion of localizationists. There were some psychologists and some physicians that were critics of the cortical localization theory. Sigmund Freud criticizes Wernicke and Broca regarding localization of doctrine of aphasia. So, Freud stated that the Broca and Wernicke area centers are nodal points in a general and complicated network of neurons. He proposed that Broca's and Wernicke areas were not self-acting agencies and their significance was simply due to their anatomic localization. Distinction between the ability to recognize an object and inability to name it is called agnosia, which is also a term that was coined to Freud. So, Pierre-Marie challenged Broca's findings by examining the preserved brains of the patients Broca had used to support his hypothesis of localization. Hermann Munk, experimental lesions in the association cortex of a dog produced temporary mind blindness. The animal could see objects but failed to recognize their significance. And Joseph Babinski introduced the term anosognosia, which means no knowledge of the disease, introducing the phenomenon of an awareness on the understanding of diseases. So, individuals may have some brain impairment, but they are not aware of this impairment. So here we are seeing the fundamentals of a great debate that took place in the beginning of the 20th century, which was the discussion of localization theory against functional theory or functionalization theory. So on one hand we have localization theorists which state that brain functions are localized in specific areas in the brain, and the other theorist, the functional theorist, says that the brain functions, says that the mental functions are distributed through the entire brain. Now we have these two perspectives and we try to integrate them in a coherent manner to understand how individuals function and how individuals may have some lesions in different functions in different areas of the brain. So, this is also accompanied by the notion that neurons are the fundamental units of the nervous system. Heinrich Hartz emphasized a neuron theory, which is each nerve cell communicates with others through contiguity rather than continuity. He stated that the brain has neuronal unities and neurons are the cells of these unities. Also, he stated that there are some nerve fibers which are called the cell processes. One very important neuropsychologist in the 20th century was Luria. Luria developed a conceptual model of the brain functions where he defined three different major functional areas. He developed a conceptual model for understanding the organization of higher mental abilities or faculties and proposed that human behavior correlates with brain function. So, in his model, Luria developed three main conceptions about brain functioning. So, lower brainstem structures developed to maintain the tone and energy supply of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex posterior to central sulcus, or the fissure of Rolando, are implying on the sensory impressions of visual, auditory and tactile nature and are identified, perceived and organized for comprehension. And 3. The cerebral cortex, anterior to or in front of the central sulcus, are specialized on the production and monitoring of motor responses. So these were the main neuropsychologists that help neuropsychology to reach to its form today. So now let's look at different kinds of or different branches from neuropsychology. So we can find different sub-areas here. Experimental neuropsychology, clinical neuropsychology, cognitive neuropsychology, forensic neuropsychology, and educational neuropsychology. Don't worry, in the future I will produce some videos talking about each one of these subfields, okay? So, clinical neuropsychology is more focused on the assessment and rehabilitation on neurocognitive deficits caused by brain injury, brain diseases, or brain malfunctioning. Forensic neuropsychology is focused on the study on how brain behavior relationships may help to assess criminal issues, and schools neuropsychologist is focused on how to foster neurocognitive processes related to learning and related to the acquisition of school contents. So typically, clinical neuropsychologists or neuropsychologists use standardized tests to assess different connections between brain functioning and behavioral actions. So, standardized tests are used to link cognitive and behavioral performance to specific neurocognitive processes. And neuropsychologists use individualized neuropsychology assessment to explore deficits and inform diagnosis. Standardization is known as the normative data, which allows comparisons between individuals who have brain deficits with individuals who do not have brain deficits. So this is some types of scales that neuropsychologists tend to use, such as Visual Memory Scale, Wisconsin Card Sorting Test, or the Bentham Visual Retention Test. So also there are other methods that neuropsychologists use to explore the activity of brain functioning, which are functional magnetic resonance imaging, positron emission tomography, or computed axial tomography. Also, there are other projects that may foster neuropsychology as a field, which are animal brain models and artificial intelligence, or the use of electrophysiology, such as electroencephalography or magnetoencephalography. And neuropsychologists also use experimental tasks to measure reaction times and accuracy to explore performance in these same tasks. So what is important to know is that neuropsychology has lots of major what is important to know is that neuropsychology is a scientific field that studies the relationship between brain behavior and cognition, and starts to understand how the brain functioning impacts on neurocognitive processes and how neurocognitive processes impact on overt behavior. So this is a very important notion to have about the scientific purpose of neuropsychology. And now let's just summarize the contents of today. So in the beginning of the century there was a great debate between localization and cerebral function, which was very important to the development of new ideas and new concepts and new empirical findings regarding the connection between cognition, brain and behavior. Broca and Wernicke were very important on the idea of the localization of the motor speech production and speech comprehension. Developed an integrated model to understand about how the brain works within the speech phenomenon. Also, and actually, neuropsychology has different sub-areas and has different methods of research. Well, it's all for today. Don't forget to see this video's description regarding today's theme to see the manuals and the books that I use to develop a video like this. Also, if you like what I'm doing here, please consider to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications, which is very important to support my channel. Also, you can give a comment to express your mind and to express your thoughts and to say something about the themes that you've heard here today. Welcome to Mind Brain Talks, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!